The COVID-19 pandemic led to an intensification of the capitalist crisis, consistently shaking all aspects of our everyday lives to the core. This hits working-class women particularly hard, but we're not here to whine, we're here to fight. My name is Katy Peter, and today I will be presenting the IMT's ideas on women's liberation and revolution. The division of society into classes became extremely obvious during the pandemic. While the capitalists were able to multiply their already obscene wealth during the previous 2 years, the working class, on the other hand, faced nothing but increasing pressure and decreasing living standards. The parts of the working class that are generally hit the hardest by oppression and exploitation have once again had to feel this most clearly: women. In the Czech Republic, even though we generally have a relatively low unemployment rate, the female unemployment rate is still significantly higher than the male one. This becomes even more obvious when you look at the actual employment rate. While approximately 8.2% of men between the ages of 15 to 64 were employed, it's only approximately 68% of the women in the same age group. The extreme poles of more work pressure on one side and layoff waves on the other hand especially hit typical women's jobs like in the social and healthcare sector, as well as retail and gastronomy. The pandemic exacerbates women's poverty, especially for single moms. At the beginning of the pandemic, the United Nations expected a global decrease of women's poverty by 2.7% between 2019 and 2021, but they actually had to update their expectations to an increase by 9.1%. This is no coincidence, but it actually has a system in capitalism. The fact that women can bear children becomes a factor of oppression in class society. In capitalism, we see that pregnancy and parental leave lead to lower pay and often to poverty in old age, and to women having the main or sole responsibility for the household and children. Family is all too often duty rather than a choice. Women's bodies are political bargaining chips, as we can see very clearly on the discussion on a ban of abortions. Women's bodies are being treated like property on a daily basis, whose most crass expression are prostitution and violence in relationships. None of these facts are accidents, but they are all inherent components of class society. So, how do we fight it? Denying biological differences between men and women, like many postmodern theories do, will not end oppression. The only chance we stand to abolish it for good is the revolutionary struggle of the working class against capitalism. This is not to say that a revolution will just make magically all the injustice of a capitalist society disappear, but capitalism needs the oppression of women, the division of the working class along gender lines, as well as race, religion, sexual orientation, you name it. For capitalism, this is profitable. It justifies the low pay of certain layers of the working class, while in turn puts wage pressures on higher paid sectors. The undeclared work, especially concerning migrant workers in sectors like the gastronomy, are not an exception to the rule, but rather a permanent feature of capitalism. Without those cheap forces of labor, as we can also see in the 24-hour caregivers, the social system would collapse. The situation we have only helps the profit. Only by abolishing the capitalist system can we lay the basis to get rid of oppression altogether. The division of the working class is also a useful tool to undermine solidarity and the common struggle, because the truth is, the working class, men and women, no matter their origin, have a common interest to fight against capital. The blatant oppression of women and sexism easily lead to the view that women's struggle for liberation should be led primarily by them alone as women, but in practice that actually leads to a weakening of the fight. We must combat sexism in our own ranks and thus establish unity of the class. Male and female workers have no contradictory interests. As Marxists, we therefore resolutely oppose any division, including the myth of feminism that women could only assert their interests against men. The role of identity politics, which sees various mechanisms of oppression as unbridgeable barriers in the common struggle, has been a direct obstacle in social struggles in recent years. Feminists tried their concepts in several countries, as we've seen in the last couple of years, for example in Switzerland, Spain, but also to some degree in Austria, where they tried to enforce something they called women's strike, according to which men should not join the strike or even be accomplices. They also tried to organize demonstrations and movements according to the logic of representation. In those, not the political ideas of how to conduct the struggle are the center of attention, but the representative logic. It means the form of oppression you belong to will determine whether or not you will be allowed to hold speeches, what kind of character the demonstration will have, and which slogans are going to be raised. Instead of putting the unifying class struggle in the foreground, this opens up to cooperation with the bourgeoisie, who pretend to be feminist or LGBT-friendly or whatever, however it suits them. However, as Marxists, we know that the proletariat can only go forward in the common struggle against exploitation and oppression. During the history of class societies, capitalism first established the basis for the liberation of women, that is, as a part of the working class. Inside the collective action, in the form of strikes, work struggles, and mass protests, the women are not isolated anymore like they were inside individual households, but they actually become a very important part of the power of the collective working class. Working class women have no separate interests to working class men. The women of the capitalist class, on the other hand, actually do have to prevail over their interests in property, inheritance, and board positions against the ones of the men of their class. In one thing, however, the men and women of the bourgeoisie will both agree on. Namely, when it comes to the exploitation of the male and female working class. As the famous revolutionary Clara Zetkin put it in 1896 on the Congress of the German Social Democratic Party, and I quote, "Therefore, the liberation struggle of the proletarian woman cannot be similar to the struggle that the bourgeois woman wages against the male of her class. On the contrary, it must be a joint struggle with the male of her class against the entire class of capitalists. Her final aim is not the free competition with the man, but the achievement of the political rule of the proletariat." The greed of capitalists on their hunt for profits knows no limits. If there wasn't the teeny tiny little inconvenience that workers also have to survive in order to work. The reproduction of labor power is an expensive annoyance to the capitalist class. Unfortunately, workers also need healthcare, a few hours of sleep, time to cook, clean, care for children, as well as some level of education. Of course, however, they try their best to keep the cost for all that to a minimum. Austerity measures in the healthcare sector have been going on in most countries all over the world for decades, which almost led to the collapse of the health system during the pandemic and left the people working in the sector with waves of layoffs, bringing the ones who remained close to burnouts. The scenario we face today is a direct result of capitalist profit economy. The situation seems to only get worse and worse, right? However, this also triggered movements across Europe. In Austria, for example, the healthcare workers showed that they are not only angry but also ready to fight by showing their power on the streets last fall. Thousands of elementary teachers flooded the streets to fight for better working conditions. At the same time, something that the union originally planned as a mere photo campaign for social media triggered strike-like situations at some locations as the workers left their workplaces for the photo campaign during their shifts, and it would absolutely be their union's responsibility to organize these spontaneous outbreaks of workers who are so clearly looking for an expression of their anger. In order to add a buffer to the gaping holes of our social security system, capitalism relies mainly on the family. During the pandemic, students were told to study from their homes for months. Social balancing and variety were almost non-existent, but the more capitalism needs to depend on the family as a social security net, the more it will challenge the relationship between its members. Because of homeschooling, parents had to face an increased amount of time they had to spend on childcare. This often had to take place in an already small space, just adding more stress to the already increased pressure at the workplace or leaving people to loneliness on the other hand. Capitalism reinforces gender-specific work distribution systematically, and it prevents women from actually having control over their own lives. Women still tend to earn less money than their male co-workers, and this also means that they are naturally more likely to give up their jobs or go into part-time jobs in order to care for their children, merely because it makes sense for the better paid person to stay in their job in order to sustain the family. The lack of kindergartens and their opening hours makes a compatibility between work and family impossible. At the same time, the pandemic also brought to light clearer than ever that much too high working hours also prevented fathers from taking an active part in their children's lives. The forced short-time work during the pandemic led to dads spending more time on childcare as well. Women in the kitchen. This doesn't only mean cooking, cleaning, taking care of children. No, it also includes caring for the sick and elderly. This is a permanent element of the capitalist social system. Of course, it's much cheaper this way than actually establishing qualitative and professional nursing homes or building public kitchens and cleaning services. We need to bust chains of the economic functional pragmatism in order to build a society where personal relationships can actually be based on respect, on freedom, and on mutual affection. The oppression of women is rooted deeply in our society, and it blossoms new, poisonous flowers every day. From a very young age, we are being pressed into social roles. Women are expected to be attractive, perfect mothers, and businesswomen at the same time. These unreachable ideals are more and more turning into sheer mockery as rental prices go up, job opportunities go down, and our very basis of life is being threatened by climate change. The ruling class pretends to be very surprised by the fact that depressive symptoms amongst the youth have been on the rise since the beginning of the pandemic, even resulting in suicidal thoughts on many. At the same time, influencers are trying to make us believe there can be such a thing as a perfect life. The recently leaked Facebook papers proved that the company has known about negative psychological impact of their social media channels since 2012. An internal document stated that they expect every third girl to develop an unrealistic perception of her body. But not just that. The company also tolerated public advertisements of drug cartels and human traffickers for years, bringing young girls into home slavery and prostitution. There is evidence that they continuously and knowingly ignored reports and warnings by their employees on this issue. The control over the own body and sexuality under capitalism is being subordinated under the rule of profit. Contraceptives and sanitary products are not free of charge or easily accessible. Sex education is still severely insufficient and all too often unscientific and dominated by traditional, aka religious morality. Until this day, abortions are not legal, for free, or easily accessible in many countries, including the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Gender-specific medicine is still severely underfinanced. For example, during the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, not one single study was conducted to research the effect of the vaccine on period disruptions that many people encountered. The effects are probably only of temporary nature, but in the face of widespread rumors and fear that the vaccine could lead to fertility problems, it's just one more issue that proves that women and their health are of secondary importance to medical science. The same thing is true for the systematic discrimination of LGBT people in healthcare. For example, when it comes to treatments like hormonal therapy, body-adjusting surgery, or psychological support. As a minor in the Czech Republic, you need to get both your parents' signatures in order to get access to treatment against STIs, causing many young people from the LGBT community severe stress, trauma, and is actively endangering their physical and mental health. The crassest expression of women's oppression are femicides. Coming from Austria, this is also like a very pressing issue for me personally. But the Czech Republic is also not much better. It actually has the 4th highest rate of domestic violence and femicides in Europe. In most cases, they were being murdered by family members or intimate partners or ex-partners. The economic independence of women is forcing them to stay in unhappy or even violent relationships, making economic independence a core element to prevent violence. This can simply be supplemented by more women's shelters, even though this would be already like a small but necessary step forward. But even this basic form of security doesn't matter to the ruling class. Women's shelters remain severely underfinanced. Instead of improving the situation, or at least trying, they like to push the problems away from the families and picture violence against women as something that has been imported by migrants and foreigners. Generally, we can't rely on the state. It's not like some neutral, class-independent institution that is here to protect us. While the government is always in a hurry to give tax benefits to big companies, they like to make social injustice and women's oppression into individual problems. We don't have any illusions in the state to bring about a solution to women's oppression. Even the things that have been achieved in the past were never given to the working class in some act of charity. We always had to struggle to gain a minimum of progress. We have to move forward in mass actions of the proletariat, stop fighting for crumbs and start fighting for the whole bakery. The oppression of women is a fact. But in order to get rid of it, it's not enough to see that. We need to be absolutely clear. The primary foundation of women's oppression is not patriarchy, but it's capitalism. When you look at the material condition for women's oppression under capitalism, this becomes absolutely clear. Capitalism, as we saw, continues to reproduce oppression and diversion of the working class because it is profitable and it acts as a stabilizing factor to their rule. Who is going to fight against women's oppression? We say only women and men together as part of the united working class can abolish capitalism together and therefore prepare the material conditions for the abolishing of women's oppression as well as other forms of oppression and discrimination. We need to win over both the male and female colleagues for this idea and demand we all fight together against women's oppression. Lastly, there's only one question remaining. How? How do we fight against oppression and capital? We can have demands, but at the end of the day, it's a lost cause to appeal to the ruling class and ask them for institutional participation. It will only allow some careerists to rise up. The struggle against violence against women will not be won by begging the bourgeois government. We need to struggle against this very government and the capitalists supporting it in their own interest. The organizations of the working class need to transform back into real tools for organizing the class struggle. We have to fight their logic of cooperation with the bosses. Their working class organizations, above all the unions, should run a campaign for higher wages, better working conditions, and against sexism, always in direct and natural contact with the working class. This has to be supported by strikes and mass mobilizations. That is how you fight sexism and oppression in practice, not by only complaining about it. That is how you raise the confidence of women and solidarity within the working class effectively. Within the last couple of months, we have seen big class struggles with revolutionary potential spontaneously popping up all across the globe. The most precarious and oppressed layers entered the stage of history and showed that they were no longer ready to accept the rules of capitalism. The so-called gig economy has seen a revival within the Union, with the strikes of Amazon workers in Italy, Germany, the USA, the longest strike in the history of the British gig economy last December, and the founding of unions at Starbucks in the USA. In Sudan, in the Sudan Revolution, that has been going on since 2019, women show to be some of the bravest and most radical parts of the movement. In Austria, the private social sector was one of the most active parts of working class movements before the pandemic, and in Great Britain, the unions faced a massive push to the left when their right-wing leadership was voted out and replaced by militant activists. The contradictions of the capitalist system are getting more pressing every day. The time for big class struggle is inevitable. And the question of women's liberation is inseparable from the struggle against the capitalist system, and it needs to be organized and discussed as such. What we need is an offensive of the working class against exploitation, sexism, and oppression, and a common struggle of the working class and the youth, including women, men, and all of humanity together, for the overthrow of the capitalist system and for socialism in our lifetime. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening and your interest. For those who now have some more time and want to know more or ask some questions, just engage in a discussion. You can join our discussion. We are organizing it online, and the link for that you can find it in the description of this stream. So I hope to see you all there in a minute.